The bridge of the flagship Eternal Light hummed with tension as Unastra commanded her fleet from a throne of silver and crystal, and Taiho stood beside her as her advisor, and the crew had stopped questioning his presence weeks ago. The Kreth fleet appeared on the display like a swarm of angry insects, and there were more ships than anyone had anticipated, and the Syndicate had clearly been planning this assault for years. They outnumber us 3-1, the tactical officer reported, and fear crept into his voice. Numbers mean nothing if they lack conviction. Unastra replied, and her voice carried calm through the bridge. The Kreth fight for profit, and we fight for our homes, and we will show them the difference. The battle began with fire blooming across the darkness of space, and Valorian ships moved with graceful precision, and Kreth vessels swarmed like predators, and between them, death danced in bolts of energy and explosions of light. Taiho studied the enemy movements, and he saw patterns that the Valorian officers missed, and human tactical training was different from Valorian, and he noticed things they would never consider. "They are hurting us," he said suddenly. "Look at their formation, and they want us to push toward the center." Unastra examined the display, and her eyes widened. "You are right," she said. "It is a trap, and they want to surround us." She issued new orders, and the Valorian fleet shifted, and the trap closed on empty space instead of ships, and for a moment the tide seemed to turn. Then the unthinkable happened. 3 Valorian ships broke formation and turned their weapons on their own fleet, and explosions ripped through vessels that had not expected betrayal, and chaos erupted. Across every channel, Kethvora, Unastra, snarled, and she had known her rival was ambitious, but she had not believed the matriarch would betray her entire species. She made a deal with the Syndicate. The traitor ships targeted the flagship, and warnings screamed across the bridge, and Taiho grabbed Unastra and pulled her down as an explosion tore through the upper decks. "We are being boarded," the security chief reported, and his voice came through damaged speakers. "Kreth soldiers are on deck 7-12 and moving toward the bridge." Unastra rose with fury burning in her eyes. "Coordinate our loyal ships," she ordered. "Push back against the traitors and destroy the Kreth flagship if you can." She turned to Taiho, and something passed between them that did not need words. "The bridge crew can handle the battle," he said. "But if they reach you, it is over, and let me hold them off." "Taiho, I finally found something worth fighting for," he said, and he managed to smile. "Let me do what you claimed me for." She grabbed his face and pressed her forehead against his, and it was a Valorian gesture of deep connection, and her patterns pulsed with emotion. She could not speak. "Come back to me," she whispered. "I will." He ran. The corridors of the flagship had become a war zone, and Kreth soldiers pushed through the lower decks, and Valorian defenders fell back step by step, and Taiho moved against the flow like a salmon swimming upstream. He gathered defenders as he went, and his reputation preceded him, and soldiers who had seen him fight rallied behind the human who was called the Unyielding. They made their stand at a junction 3 decks below the bridge, and Taiho positioned his fighters and used the corridors like funnels, and when the Kreth came, they met resistance that stalked them cold. The fighting was brutal and close, and Taiho killed with hands and blade and whatever weapon he could grab, and the Kreth kept coming, and he kept putting them down. But the enemy had numbers, and his defenders began to fall, and the line pushed back toward the bridge 1 bloody meter at a time. Then he heard a voice that turned his blood to ice. "Where is the child?" Kethvora emerged through the smoke, and she wore combat armor that gleamed with stolen light, and her eyes held madness that had been hiding beneath ambition all along. "Siovari," she continued, and her smile was cruel. "I know she is aboard because Unastra would never leave her behind, and when I find her, I will use her to break her mother completely." Rage exploded through Taiho, and he charged. Kethvora was faster and stronger and better armed, and she caught his first strike and threw him against the wall like he weighed nothing. "You should have stayed on your primitive world, human," she said, and she advanced toward him with casual confidence. "You are nothing but an animal pretending to be one of us." Taiho rose and his body screamed with pain, and he faced her. "Anyway, you are wrong," he said, and his voice was steady despite everything. "I am not pretending to be Valorian, and I am human, and that is exactly what you should be afraid of." He attacked again, and she blocked and countered, and her blade cut a line of fire across his chest, and he ignored it and kept coming. She struck him down, and he rose. She broke his arm, and he fought with the other. She put him on his knees, and he spat blood at her feet and pushed himself upright again. "What is wrong with you?" she screamed, and for the first time fear entered her voice. "Why will you not stay down?" "Because I'm human," he said, and the words came from somewhere deep inside, and they carried the weight of every soldier who had ever refused to surrender. "And we do not stop." He lunged one final time, and she stabbed him through the shoulder. And the pain was blinding, but he had expected it, and he used her blade as a lever and pulled her close and drove his forehead into her face with every ounce of strength he had left. Bones cracked, and Kethvora stumbled backward, and Taio's good hand found her throat, and he squeezed. "Yield," he growled. "Never," she choked. The energy bolt came from behind and struck Kethvora in the back, and she collapsed, and Yunastra stood in the corridor with a weapon in her hand and fire in her eyes. "It is over," she said. The battle ended not with a final explosion, but with a slow collapse of enemy morale, and the traitor ships surrendered when their leader fell, and the Kreth fleet retreated when they realized the fight had cost too much. Taiho woke in the medical bay again, and it was becoming a habit, and the ceiling above him was the same soft blue as before. "You need to stop doing this," a voice said, and Silvari was there, and tears streaked her silver face. "You keep getting hurt, and you need to stop." "I am sorry, little one," he said, and his voice was weak, but it was enough. "I will try to be more careful." Yunastra entered, and she dismissed the physicians with a look, and sat beside his bed and took his hand in hers. "The sovereignty has officially recognized you," she said, and her voice was soft in a way he had never heard before, not just as claimed, but as a defender of Velora, "and they have granted you citizenship and the title of protector of House Astra. That sounds like a lot of responsibility." "It is," she agreed. "But you have earned it, and you have earned so much more." She leaned close, and her patterns pulsed with colors he had learned to recognize. "You are not claimed anymore, Taiho," she said. "That bond has been fulfilled 100 times over, and if you want to leave, you are free to go." He looked at her and at the child who had brought him into this impossible situation, and he thought about everything he had lost and everything he had found. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked. "No," she said, and the word carried more emotion than any speech. "I want you to stay, and not because you are claimed, and not because you owe me anything, but because this is your home and we are your family, and I." She stopped, and vulnerability crossed her face. "I do not want to face the future without you." She finished. Taiho smiled, and it hurt, but it was a good kind of pain. "Then I am staying," he said. "Not because I am claimed, but because I choose to." He reached up and touched her face, and her patterns flared with joy. "I choose you," he said. "I choose this family, and I choose this home. And I choose whatever comes next as long as we face it together." Yunastra smiled, and she bent down and pressed her lips to his. And the kiss was gentle and fierce and full of promise. Silvari cheered and clapped her hands, and her bioluminescent patterns blazed like fireworks. Later they stood together on the observation deck, and Velora Prime rose before them, and Silvari held his hand on one side, and Yunastra stood close on the other. "Welcome home," Yunastra said. Taiho looked at the world that had become his sanctuary and the family that had become his purpose, and he finally understood what he had been searching for all along. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just a place where he belonged, and he had found it in the most unlikely place in the galaxy, in the arms of an alien mother who had claimed him and a child who had never let him go. The training hall stretched before Taiho like a cathedral built for violence, and the walls were lined with weapons he did not recognize, and the floor was marked with patterns that seemed to shift. When he was not looking directly at them, Astra stood in the center of the hall, and she had traded her elegant robes for simple training clothes, and she looked different now, and there was a predator lurking. Beneath her graceful exterior, the Lorians are stronger than humans, she said, and her voice echoed through the empty space. We are faster, and our senses are sharper, and in a direct confrontation, you would lose every single time. That is encouraging, Taiho muttered. But humans have something we lack, she continued as if he had not spoken. You adapt, and you improvise, and you refuse to accept defeat, even when it is inevitable. And these traits have made your species one of the most feared in the galaxy. Despite your physical limitations, she moved, and Taiho barely saw. It happened, and suddenly she was beside him, and her hand was at his throat, and the message was clear. I will teach you our combat forms, she said, and her breath was warm against his ear. And you will teach me how humans fight, and together we will create something new. The training was brutal every day. Taiho woke before dawn and met Astra in the hall, and she pushed him harder than any drill instructor ever had, and she showed no mercy. When he fell, and she expected him to rise every single time, he learned the Valorian forms, and they were elegant and precise, and they relied on speed and grace that his human body struggled to match, and he failed more times than he could count. But he also showed her things that surprised her. Human martial arts were messy and unpredictable, and they used the body as a weapon in ways Valorians had never considered, and he taught her joint locks and throws and the dirty fighting techniques that soldiers learned when survival mattered. More than honor, your people fight like cornered animals, Astra observed one afternoon, and they were both breathing hard and covered in sweat. There is no elegance in it. Elegance does not win fights, Taiho replied. Surviving does. She smiled, and it transformed her face, and he realized it was the first time he had seen her truly smile. Perhaps you are right. Silvari watched their training sessions from a balcony above the hall, and she cheered when Taiho scored a hit and groaned when her mother put him on the ground, and her presence made the pain worth it somehow. Weeks passed, and Taiho felt himself changing. His body grew stronger and faster, and he learned to anticipate Valorian attacks and counter them with human unpredictability. And he began winning sparring matches against guards who had trained their entire lives. But more importantly, his mind began to heal. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent now, and when he woke in darkness, he no longer reached for a weapon that was not there, and instead, he thought about the training ahead and the child who would greet him at breakfast, and the woman who was slowly becoming something more than just his. Matriarch Astra noticed the change. You are different, she said one evening, and they were sitting in the garden, and the singing flowers filled the air with gentle melodies. When you first came here, you were hollow, and now there is something behind your eyes again. I have forgotten what purpose felt like, Taiho admitted. I spent so long running from my past that I forgot how to run towards something. Tell me about them, she said, and he knew she meant his squad. Tell me about the people you lost. And he did. He told her about Park and Kim and Lee and all the others. And he told her about the mission that went wrong and the choices he made and the guilt that had eaten him alive for years. She listened without judgment, and when he finished, she reached out and took his hand. They would want you to live, she said. Not exist, but truly live, and I think they would be proud of what you are becoming. Taiho felt something break inside his chest, and it was not his heart, but the wall around it, and tears fell down his face, and he did not try to stop them. The gathering of matriarchs came at the end of his 3rd month on Valora Prime, the great hall filled with the most powerful women in the sovereignty, and they came to discuss the growing threat of the Crest Syndicate and to assess the strength of each household, and Astra brought Taiho as part of her delegation. The whispers started the moment he entered. Kethvora was there, and her smile was sharp as she watched him cross the hall, and she had been spreading rumors. For weeks, and many of the matriarchs looked at him with open contempt. The human should not be here. One of them said loudly enough for everyone to hear. This is a gathering for Valorians, not pets. Taiho felt anger rise in his chest, but Yunastra touched his arm. Wait, she whispered. A warrior from Kethvora's household stepped forward, and he was massive, even by Valorian standards, and his bioluminescent patterns pulsed with aggressive reds. I challenge the human, the warrior announced. Let him prove his worth or be exposed as the weakness he truly is. The hall fell silent, and every eye turned to Taiho. Yunastra's hand tightened on his arm, but she did not stop him as he stepped forward. I accept. The circle formed around them. And Taiho faced the warrior who was called Vesnor, and he was faster and stronger and more experienced, and by every measure. Taiho should have lost, but Taiho had spent 3 months learning to fight like a Valorian and 3 decades learning to fight like a human, and he had something Vesnor did not expect. He had absolutely nothing to lose. The fight began, and Vesnor attacked with textbook precision, and Taiho let the blow connect and used the momentum to roll behind his opponent and drove his elbow into the warrior's kidney. Vesnor spun with a strike that should have taken Taiho's head off, but Taiho was already moving, and he dropped low and swept the warrior's legs, and when Vesnor fell, Taiho was on top of him with a hold that threatened to break his arm. Yield, Taiho said. Vesnor struggled, but the hold was solid, and human joint locks worked on Valorian bodies just as well as human ones. I yield, the warrior spat, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Taiho released him and stood, and the hall was silent. Then Yunastra began to clap, and slowly others joined her. And even some of the matriarchs, who had looked at him with contempt, were nodding with something like respect. The unyielding one of the older matriarchs said, and she was ancient, and her patterns barely glowed, but her voice commanded. Attention! That shall be his title, and he has earned it. Kethvora's expression twisted with fury, but she said nothing because even she could not argue with what everyone had just witnessed. Later that night, as they returned to the household, a message arrived that changed everything. The Kreth Syndicate had mobilized a fleet, and they were heading for Valorian space and the bounty on Taiho's head had been a distraction, and the real goal was revenge against the sovereignty for interfering in their operations for years. War was coming. Yunastra was summoned to lead the defensive fleet, and she stood before Taiho in the entrance. Hall and her eyes searched his face. I must go, she said, and I need to know what you want to do. It was the first time she had asked instead of commanded. Taiho thought about everything he had gained since coming to Valora Prime, and he thought about Seal Vari and the household that had become his family, and he thought about the woman standing before him who had given him back his purpose. I will stand with you, he said. I will stand with my family. Yunastra smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Then we go together. Valora Prime rose into view through the observation window, and Taiho stood transfixed by the sight of a world that seemed to glow with inner light, and vast oceans reflected the silver sun, and continents stretched across the surface like paintings made by gods. Beautiful, is it not? Yunastra said from behind him, and she had approached without making a sound. I have never seen anything like it, Taiho admitted, and he had traveled to dozens of worlds during his military service, but none of them had prepared him for this. This is your home now, she said, and the words carried weight that pressed against his chest. Whatever you were before does not matter here, and you are House Astra, and that is all anyone needs to know. The ship descended through clouds that sparkled with crystalline particles, and Taiho watched as the capital city emerged below them, and towers of white stone reached toward the sky, and bridges connected them like threads of silver, and everywhere he looked There was beauty that seemed almost painful. They landed on a platform attached to the largest tower, and servants waited in neat rows, and they bowed as Unastra descended the ramp with Silvari holding her hand and Taiho following behind like a shadow that did not quite belong. The servants stared at him, and he could feel their curiosity and their confusion, and perhaps their disapproval, because humans were not supposed to be here, and they were certainly not supposed to be claimed by a high matriarch. "This is Yun Taiho," Unastra announced, and her voice rang out across the platform. "He is claimed by House Astra, and you will treat him with the respect that position deserves." The servants bowed again, but Taiho noticed that some of them did so with reluctance, and he understood that earning acceptance here would take more than the matriarch's word. Days turned into weeks, and Taiho struggled to find his place in a world that made no sense to him. The household was enormous, and it contained not just servants, but extended family and advisors and guards and scholars, and each of them had a role and a purpose, and Taiho had neither. He was given quarters that were larger than any apartment he had ever rented, and the bed was soft, and the food was plentiful, and he had never been more uncomfortable in his life. Silvari became his constant companion, and she appeared at his door every morning and dragged him through the household on adventures that only a child could imagine, and she taught him words in her language and laughed when he pronounced them wrong. "You sound like a baby," she told him one afternoon, and they were sitting in a garden filled with flowers that sang when the wind touched them. "But that is okay, because babies learn, and you will learn too. Your mother is very patient with me." Taiho said, "Mother likes you." Silvari replied with the certainty that only children possess. "She watches you when you are not looking, and she smiles." Sometimes, Taiho did not know what to do with that information, so he changed the subject. The political situation became clear over the following weeks, and Taiho learned that Unastra had enemies who resented her power and her influence, and they saw his presence as weakness. Matriarch Kethvora visited the household one evening, and she was taller than Unastra, and her bioluminescent patterns pulsed with colors that seemed aggressive, and her eyes swept over Taiho like he was something unpleasant she had found on her shoe. "So this is the human," Kethvora said, and she did not bother hiding her contempt. "I had heard the rumors, but I did not believe you would actually bring such a creature into your household." "Taiho saved my daughter's life," Unastra replied, and her voice was calm, but Taiho had learned to recognize the steel beneath her words. The claiming was appropriate and necessary. "The claiming was weakness," Kethvora said. "You have taken a primitive species into your house and elevated it above its station, and the other matriarchs are talking, and they are not saying kind things. Let them talk." Unastra said, "I do not require their approval." Kethvora smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Perhaps not," she said, "but you may require their support soon, and there are rumors of trouble on the borders, and the Kreth Syndicate is moving ships into positions they have never held before, and some believe they are planning something." "Syndicate is always planning something." "Yes, but this time they seem particularly motivated." Kethvora glanced at Taiho. "Perhaps they are seeking revenge for a certain incident on Nexus Point." She departed after delivering her warning, and Taiho watched her go with a cold feeling in his stomach. "She knows about the bounty," he said. "Everyone knows about the bounty," Unastra replied. "The Syndicate made sure of that, and they want you afraid, and they want me to cast you out to save myself." "The trouble." "Maybe you should," Taiho said, and the words hurt to speak. "I have brought danger to your household and your daughter, and perhaps Kethvora is right, and I am a liability." Unastra turned to face him, and her expression was unreadable. "Do you know what my mate said to me before he died?" she asked, and the question caught Taiho off guard. "He said that our people had forgotten how to be brave, and we had become so focused on politics and power that we no longer remembered what it meant to simply do the right thing." She stepped closer, and her eyes held his. You reminded me of that, she said. You saw a child in danger, and you did not calculate the odds or consider the consequences, and you simply acted. And that is something rare and precious, and I will not throw it away because of fear. A chime sounded through the household, and one of the guards rushed into the room with urgency written across his face. Matriarch, he said, we have detected intruders in the eastern wing, and they appear to be heading toward the child's quarters. Taiho moved before thinking, and years of training took over, and he was running toward Silvari's room while the guards struggled to keep up. He reached the corridor outside her door and found 3 figures in dark clothing, and they turned at his approach, and weapons appeared in their hands. Taiho did not slow down. He tackled the first assassin, and they crashed into the wall, and he drove his elbow into the figure's throat and heard a satisfying crunch, and the second assassin swung a blade at his head, and he ducked and grabbed the arm and twisted until the bone snapped. The third assassin raised a weapon that glowed with lethal energy, and Taiho knew he could not reach them in time. Down, Astra shouted from behind him. He dropped, and a bolt of energy passed over his head and struck the third assassin in the chest, and they collapsed without a sound. The guards arrived seconds later and secured the fallen attackers, and Taiho stood breathing hard, and his hands were shaking with adrenaline. Silvari's door opened, and the child looked out with frightened eyes. Taiho, she said, and relief flooded her voice. I heard noises and I was scared. He knelt down and opened his arms, and she ran into them and held on tight. Young Astra watched them, and something in her expression shifted, and it might have been a decision being made. The threat is real, she said to her guards. Increase security and send word to our allies, and we need to know who sent these assassins. She looked at Taiho and the child in his arms. And prepare the training hall, she added. If Taiho is to survive in our world, he must become more than what he is, and I will train him myself. Taiho looked up at her and understood that everything was about to change. The time for being a guest was over. Now he would become something new. Taiho opened his eyes to a ceiling he did not recognize, and soft blue light that pulsed in gentle rhythms, and the bed beneath him felt like floating on water, and for a moment he wondered if he had died. You are awake, a voice said from somewhere to his left, and the words were translated through a device he could not see. Please remain still, because your injuries were severe. He turned his head and saw a Valorian male in what looked like medical robes, and the alien's silver skin had patterns that glowed with soft green light, and his eyes held the calm patience of someone who had watched many patients wake in confusion. Where am I? Taiho asked, and his voice came out rough like sandpaper. You are aboard the diplomatic vessel Eternal Grace, the physician replied. You have been unconscious for 3 standard days while your body healed. 3 days felt like a lifetime, and Taiho tried to sit up. The gentle hands pushed him back down. The child, he said, and the memory came flooding back with the force of a breaking wave. The little girl with silver skin and violet eyes. And is she safe? The physician smiled, and it was strange to see such a human expression on an alien face. Young Silvari is perfectly well, he said. She has visited you 17 times since you were brought aboard, and each time she refused to leave until her mother came to collect her. Her mother, Taiho repeated, and fragments of memory surfaced through the fog, and he recalled a tall figure blazing with light and words he did not understand. High Matriarch Yun Astra, the physician said, and respect colored every syllable. One of the most powerful figures in the Valorian sovereignty, and the mother of the child you protected. Taiho closed his eyes and processed this information, and he realized that he had stumbled into something far more complicated than a random rescue in a marketplace. I need to leave, he said. I have work on the station and people expecting me. I am afraid that is not possible, the physician replied. The matriarch has claimed you, and until she releases you from that claim, you cannot leave this vessel. Claimed me. Taiho felt anger rising in his chest, and he did not care how powerful this matriarch was because no one owned him. I am not property. The physician held up his hands in a gesture that seemed meant to calm. You misunderstand, he said. The claiming is not slavery, and it is actually quite the opposite, and the matriarch has taken responsibility for you and your well-being and your future, and this is a great honor among our people. Before Taiho could argue further, the door to the medical bay slid open, and a woman from his fragmented memories entered, and she was even more striking than he remembered. Young Astra stood tall and straight with silver skin that seemed to glow from within, and her bioluminescent patterns traced elegant lines across her face and down her neck, and her eyes were the same violet as her daughter's, but they held depths that spoke of age and wisdom and pain. Leave us, she said to the physician, and her voice carried absolute authority. The physician bowed and departed without a word, and Taiho was left alone with the most powerful Valorian he had ever met. She approached his bed and studied him with those violet eyes, and he felt like a specimen under a microscope, but he refused to look away. Sergeant Yoon Taiho, she said, and his name sounded different in her accent. I have learned much about you in the past 3 days, and your military record is impressive, and your resignation was unexpected, and your reasons for leaving remain classified. You investigated me, Taiho said flatly. Of course, she replied without apology. A stranger nearly died protecting my daughter, and I needed to understand what kind of being would do such a thing. I saw a child in danger. Taiho said, I did not need a reason beyond that. Something shifted in her expression, and it might have been surprise or respect or something else entirely. That is precisely why I have claimed you, she said, and she pulled a chair close to his bed and sat with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in positions of power. Among my people, there is an ancient tradition that dates back thousands of years, and when someone risks their life for another without expectation of reward, they create what we call a soul debt. I do not want a debt, Taiho said. I want to go back to my life. What life? Yoon Astra asked, and her voice was gentle, but her words cut deep. A security job on a remote station, where you drink alone every night and wait for death to finally catch up with you. Taiho said nothing because she was right, and he hated that she was right. The claiming is not about what you want, she continued. It is about what is owed and what is right. And my daughter is alive because of you, and our law demands that I take responsibility for the one who saved her. And if I refuse, then you shame us both, she said. You shame yourself by rejecting the honor you have earned, and you shame me by suggesting my gratitude is worthless, and neither of us wants that. Taiho stared at the ceiling and thought about the life he had built on running away from everything and everyone, and he thought about the squad he had lost and the guilt that aided him every single day. What does being claimed actually mean? He asked finally. It means you belong to my household, Yoon Astra said. You will be given quarters and status and protection and purpose, and you will never want for anything again. And in return, you will serve my family with the same loyalty you showed my daughter. I am not a servant. No, she agreed. You are something far more valuable, and you are someone who acts without thinking of himself. And my people have forgotten how to do that. And we calculate every move and weigh every decision, and you simply saw a child in danger and threw yourself between her and death. She leaned forward, and her eyes held his with an intensity that made his breath catch. What were you running from, Sergeant? The question hit him like a physical blow, and memories flooded through him, and he saw his squad dying one by one on a distant world, and he heard their screams and felt their blood on his hands. I do not know anymore, he admitted, and the words tasted like surrender. Yoon Astra nodded as if she understood everything he could not say. Then stop running, she said. I have claimed you, and the galaxy will know that you belong to House Astra, and anyone who threatens you threatens me, and I protect what is mine." She stood and looked down at him, and something in her expression softened. "Rest now," she said. "When you are recovered, we will travel to my homeworld, and you will learn what it means to be part of a Valorian household, and perhaps you will find what you have been searching for." She turned to leave, but paused. At the door, "My daughter wants to see you," she said. "She has been very insistent, and may I send her in?" Taiho nodded because he could not find words, and Yanastra departed. Moments later, the door opened again, and little Silvari ran into the room, and she climbed onto his bed without permission and wrapped her small arms around him, and her bioluminescent patterns pulsed with pure joy. "You stayed," she said, and her translator rendered the words in a child's excited voice. "Mother said, 'You might leave, but I knew you would stay, and I knew it.'" Taiho looked at this small alien girl who trusted him completely, and something cracked inside his chest, and it might have been the wall he had built around his heart. "I am staying," he said, and he was surprised to realize he meant it. Later that night, a message arrived on the ship's communication system, and the contents were simple and direct, and they changed everything. The Kreth Syndicate had identified the human who had interfered with their operation, and they had placed a bounty on his head that would attract every hunter in the sector. Taiho was no longer just a man without a purpose. He was now a man with a target on his back and a new family to protect, and somehow that felt more right than anything had felt in years. Nexus Point Station hummed with the noise of 1,000 species conducting business under one roof, and Sergeant Yoon. Taiho walked through the crowded marketplace with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes scanning every shadow out of habit. He could not break. He had come to this remote trade station 6 months ago, after resigning his commission from the Earth Defense Forces, and the posting suited him perfectly because nobody here cared about his past or asked questions about the squad he had lost on Kepler 9. The marketplace stretched across 3 levels of the station, and vendors from dozens of worlds sold everything from engine parts to exotic foods to artifacts of questionable origin, and Taiho moved through the chaos like a ghost, and most species gave the human a wide berth because they had heard stories about what his kind could do when provoked. Today he was reviewing security protocols for a Tellurian merchant who feared someone might steal his shipment of rare crystals, but Taiho found his attention drifting toward a commotion near the food stalls where a small figure caught his eye. The child stood no taller than his waist, and her silver skin reflected the station lights in ways that seemed almost magical, and bioluminescent patterns traced delicate lines across her face and arms, and she looked around with wide violet eyes that held pure terror. Taiho recognized the species immediately because Valorians were famous throughout the galaxy for their beauty and their fierce matriarchal society and their complete unwillingness to tolerate any insult to their honor. But this child was alone, and that fact struck him as deeply wrong. He took 3 steps toward her before he saw the real problem. 3 Kreth had emerged from a side corridor, and they moved with the practiced coordination of predators who had done this many times before, and their forearms and scaled hides made them formidable opponents, but their reputation as slavers made them something far worse. The lead Kreth grabbed the child by her arm, and she let out a cry that pierced through the marketplace noise, but the crowd simply looked away because nobody wanted trouble with the syndicate, and getting involved meant risking everything. Taiho did not hesitate. He crossed the distance in seconds, and his fist connected with the lead Kreth's jaw before the alien even knew he was there, and the slaver released the child and stumbled backward with it. A roar of surprise and rage. "Run," Taiho said to the girl, but she stood frozen with fear, and he realized she probably did not understand his language, so he pushed her behind him and faced the 3 Kreth, who now circled him with murder in their eyes. "Human," the lead Kreth spat the word like a curse. "You have made a fatal mistake." "I have made plenty of those," Taiho replied, and he shifted into a fighting stance that felt as natural as breathing. "One more will not matter. The first Kreth lunged and Taiho dodged left and used the alien's momentum to send him crashing into a vendor stall, and the second came from behind. But Taiho had already anticipated the move, and he dropped low and swept the creature's legs out from under it. The third Kreth was smarter, and he pulled a blade from his belt, and the weapon hummed with energy but promised a painful death. And Taiho grabbed the metal tray from a nearby stall and used it as a shield. The blade cut through the tray like paper, but it bought Taiho the second he needed, and he drove his elbow into the Kreth's throat and felt cartilage crack under the impact. But the first Kreth had recovered, and 4 arms wrapped around Taiho from behind and lifted him off the ground, and the pressure on his ribs was immense, and he felt something give way with a sharp crack of pain. Taiho threw his head backward and connected with the Kreth's face, and the grip loosened just enough for him to slip free and spin around with a kick. That sent the slaver staggering. The child screamed behind him, and Taiho turned to see the second Kreth reaching for her with clawed hands and something inside him ignited with fury that burned away his exhaustion and his pain. He threw himself between them and took the claws across his back, and the pain was white-hot and blinding, but he did not fall, and he wrapped his arms around the child and shielded her with his body. The Kreth raised his claws for another strike, but a voice rang out across the marketplace with authority that froze everyone in place. "Station security," the voice announced. "Drop your weapons and surrender." The Kreth exchanged looks, and then they ran because the syndicate had rules about getting caught, and they vanished into the crowd before security could reach them. Taiho felt the strength draining from his legs, and he sank to his knees, but he kept his arms around the child because he needed to know she was safe before he could let go. "Are you hurt?" he asked her, even though he knew she probably could not understand him. She looked up at him with those violet eyes, and she shook her head, and then she pressed her face against his chest and held on to him as if he were the only solid thing in the universe. The security officers reached them, and one of them swore when she saw the blood spreading across the floor beneath. "Taiho, we need a medical team here now," she called into her communicator, and then she knelt beside him. "Can you hear me, human?" "I can hear you," Taiho said, and his voice sounded distant to his own ears. "Is the child okay?" "She's fine because of you," the officer said. "What is your name?" "Yun Taiho," he managed to say, and the world was starting to blur at the edges, and he could feel the warmth leaving his body. Sergeant Yun Taiho. The child was still holding on to him, and she was speaking now in a language he did not understand, but her voice was high and frightened, and she refused to let the officers take her away from him. "Stay with us, Sergeant," the officer said, but her voice was fading into static. Taiho's vision darkened, and the last thing he saw before consciousness left him was a tall figure pushing through the crowd, and her silver skin blazed with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed with an emotion he could not name, and she was beautiful and terrifying, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that pierced through the darkness. Then there was nothing. The child kept holding onto the human, even as the medical team arrived, and she would not let them separate her from the strange alien who had bled for her in somewhere. In the gathering crowd, her mother watched with eyes that had seen 1,000 political battles, but had never witnessed anything quite like what this human had done. The matriarch made a decision in that moment, and it was one that would change the course of 2 lives and perhaps 2 civilizations. She stepped forward, and the crowd parted before her, and she knelt beside the unconscious human and placed her hand over his heart, where she could feel the stubborn rhythm still fighting to continue. "This one," she said to the security officer. "It belongs to me now." The officer started to protest, but one look at the matriarch's face silenced her, because there were some forces in the galaxy that even station security knew better than to challenge. The matriarch gathered the human in her arms with strength that belied her elegant appearance, and her daughter followed close behind, and together they disappeared into the crowd. and the marketplace returned to its business because life on. Nexus Point waited for no one, but the story of the human who had fought 3 creth for strangers. Child spread through the station like wildfire, and by morning every species on the station knew his name.